Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as yours, but hey, it's something. Now, if you're up to date with me, you probably might be wondering, wait, are you really going to record an episode now? To which I say, yeah. And to be frank, I don't really owe you a reason. I'm not going to delve too much into it, so let's just get into the smaller channel of the day. The person in this episode is Niall Elkim. Niall is the host of a show called Dirty Left Feet, which is the third or fourth show that he's done. There was Niall Elkim versus the World, They Live. I think it technically had two iterations where it was him and another YouTuber named Charles Clark, but then it transitioned to just being about him because, that's just what happened. There was the Annihilation Cage, which was basically his search for a new co-host ever since Charles Clark left. And then one of his more prevalent shows, I guess, was Political Hack and Slash. And he's had a long history on LeftTube, I guess, or Left Twitter, or basic, I guess both, being one of the quote-unquote founders of the Dumb Left. But then around 2019, he basically started to drift slightly away from them. I wonder what happened in 2019 that caused this shift. Maybe a playlist on my channel will give you the answer. Nah, I'm just kidding, partially. But the thing is, usually his shows, I don't know if this is like a thing that's been the case for all of his shows. I know it was the case for Niall Elkim versus the World, but it's an extremely casual format, I guess. Usually the idea is that there's I guess this is basically how my podcast used to be, where it's you had a topic, but you basically didn't really plan for it. It seems that guests usually get told what they want to talk about, the day, the minute before they get on the show. I know that's happened to me. Basically framing it in a more casual conversation type. And if you're worried about the potential of this co-host leaving, don't worry. This co-host is his wife, Kaja. So unless something very, very big happens, I'm pretty sure she's here to stay. But if all the stuff that I said hasn't convinced you to watch the show yet, I do have one more ace up my sleeve. You see, if you like me, then good news. I'm basically in the live chat of every single episode. So, if you want to talk to me, that's an area where you can do it, I guess. Though preferably, if you do that, try to stay on topic. Whatever the show's about, try to focus on that. So yeah, check them out. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. First, we have some interesting news coming from Congress. Apparently, there is a controversial thing surrounding Rashida Tlaib. She introduced a House resolution to recognize the Nakba. Now you might say, what the heck is the Nakba? Well, you see, the article that I got this from, which is CBN News, I'm pretty sure that's a Christian news organization. I think that's an organization that Pat Robertson is a part of. But here's the first sentence of the paragraph, the first sentence of the article. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib on Monday introduced a new House resolution to recognize the Nakba, an Arabic term for catastrophe that Palestinians used to describe the mass displacement of Arabs during the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Now you see, I actually originally planned to say that just so I could then counteract it with what actually happened, but no. Literally, they just said it. The issue is, the Nakba is the Nakba, it's very bad because they're calling the foundation of Israel a catastrophe, but it's that clearly, that's what the headline says. It says, the headline of the article was, Rashida Tlaib introduces House bill to recognize founding of Israel as a catastrophe. But they're ignoring the part where it's no, they're not talking about the foundation of Israel. It's talking about the mass deportation, or not even deportation, basically the mass displacement of Palestinians. Yes, it is true, the term Nakba means disaster or catastrophe, but the term is used in the place of the term itself. It's like the Holocaust Holocaust was a normal word, but then it became basically synonymous with one specific event. Like, a Holocaust was a thing, but then, no, after the 6 million Jews were killed, it became the Holocaust. And now the term Holocaust is essentially synonymous with that specific event. This is kind of stupid. It really is just like, the one that I tried to describe it as is like, basically, if the U.S. Congress was getting mad and like, of members of Congress saying, we need to recognize the Trail of Tears, it's like, oh, why is the Trail of Tears such a negative name for what happened? It's like, because it was a negative thing that happened. So anyways, there's not much else to say, so let's move on to some electoral news. First, technically a continuation of my last video. You see, in the last video, I talked about the whole problem with, like, Sean Patrick Maloney and, like, all the massive, like, flip-flopping in regards to all these members of Congress basically changing what seats they want to go to, and now Mondaire Jones is running in the 10th district. Well, basically, right after the episode came out, there was a new development in that scene. Basically, due to redrawing, Alessandra Biaggi was now drawn into Mondaire Jones's district, the 17th. So instead of running in the 3rd, where a lot of progressives were kind of hesitant to back her, now she's moved to the 17th and is going to be challenging Sean Patrick Maloney. And with that, I literally changed my mind on her completely when I said, oh, Alessandra, like I even mentioned her in the last episode when I compared her to Yu Lin Yo. And it's like, oh, maybe she's a great candidate, but she's running in this specific seat with another person of a progressive thing, and she's a Warren Dem, so I don't know if I can trust her. But now in this situation, it's like, who cares? I'm perfectly content with Alessandra Biaggi running in this seat, because now she doesn't have to run against Melanie Durango, or if you're certain people, Rima Rasool. Speaking of progressives and changing seats, well, technically this one isn't changed, but it's changed the dynamics of a seat. You see, in Vermont, we all know that Vermont has one congressional seat. The incumbent Democrat of that seat is Peter Welch. Welch has decided to retire from the House to then make a run for the Senate, where he's essentially guaranteed Patrick Leahy's seat after retirement. So now, the at-large congressional district has been put into grabs, and one thing that makes it notable, of course, is that since it's an incredibly safe blue seat, basically most Democrats are, the Democratic primary has become an incredibly hot race. But also, one interesting thing is going to happen. You see, as the current ages usually do, now most people are trying to pave the way for first female representation, or first gay representation, or first trans representation. And a lot of high-profile female members of Vermont politics have decided to enter the fray. The top 3 candidates to enter were Molly Gray, the incumbent lieutenant governor, Becca Balint, a state senator, and Kesha Ram Hinsdale, another state senator, with some speculation that another person named Tanya Vishovsky was going to run in the seat as well. There were also rumors of, like, other people who are not female, like TJ Donovan, but it's very unlikely. And it's mostly likely going to be a woman who is representing Vermont in Congress in the next legislative session. However, there was one small problem. Molly Gray is more of a basic Democrat, meanwhile Becca Balint and Kesha Ram Hinsdale were both progressive candidates. And there was a massive push for this Tanya person, who is a member of the Vermont Progressive Party, so very likely she was also going to be a progressive candidate in the race. And there was a small problem. You see, not only there were people thinking, like, spoiler effect, but also it seemed that people were putting their bets on the wrong person. You see, Kesha Ram was the person who was getting, like, a lot of endorsements from Nina and Pramila Jayapal and a bunch of others, and there seemed to be more of an online movement backing her, or at least they were leaning towards her. But polling-wise, Becca was the better suited candidate. And it seems that Kesha has realized this as well, because she's decided to drop out and then endorse Becca Balint. I mean, leftist unity, I guess. And on that same level of Congress, let's look over some of the elections that happened on the 24th. A lot of progressives were talking about one race, But there were a lot more that happened that day, so let's see what happened. Of the important races in the Alabama Senate seat, the formerly endorsed by Trump, Mo Brooks, is going to be in a runoff with the neocon GOP establishment. To be blunt, this is going to be a common theme. In the Arkansas Senate race, Dan Whitfield lost. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I was expecting a win or not, because he dropped out of, well, I mean, he didn't drop out, but he wasn't able to get on the candidate filing for the last seat, so I wasn't sure if he was going to win or not, and apparently he was getting into a flame war with the leading candidate, because apparently, allegedly, he claimed that she was tearing down his signs, and she claimed that Dan Whitfield was harassing her, so basically a lot of crap went down. And next is the Minnesota District 1 special election. Richard Painter sadly lost, and I don't know if he's going to be in the regularly scheduled election or not. Now moving on to Georgia. In Georgia District 14, Marjorie Taylor Greene won, and the person that the Democrats were pushing to be their nominee, Marcus Flowers, won his election as well. Not much else I can really say about that. In Georgia District 13, unfortunately, despite what I was thinking, Vincent Ford lost, and by a very large margin. It was nowhere remotely close. I honestly figured that a higher profile candidate would win, but I guess not. In Georgia District 10, the super Trump guy, Vernon Jones, is in a runoff against another member of the GOP establishment. In Georgia District 7, Lucy McBath beat Carolyn Bordeaux. It was the DVD seat, and it looks like they're putting down another blue dog. In the Georgia Secretary of State race, Michael Owens, who was the person who actually did better than Vincent Fort in that seat, lost, unfortunately. He was a progressive, and Brad Raffensperger actually managed to win the GOP primary, to which many people were like, really? And it turns out maybe democracy was saved that night. I don't know. In the Georgia Senate race, it was pretty obvious who was winning. Radical liberal Raphael Warnock won the Democratic primary. Unfortunately, I don't support him because he didn't back Bernie's Medicare for All bill in the most recent Congress, because it was recently just introduced, and then Raphael Warnock wasn't on the sponsor list, so keeping with my tradition, bye-bye. And in the GOP primary, the football player Herschel Walker won. I mean, alright. In the Georgia gubernatorial race, Stacey Abrams ran unopposed, and David Perdue did not beat Brian Kemp, so it's a 2018 rematch. And finally, Texas, the state that everybody's talking about. First, we're going to start with Texas District 15. In a shocking turn of events, Michelle Vallejo is actually winning the seat, but as of right now, as of the time I'm recording this, it hasn't been called. In Texas District 21, Claudia Zapata won her runoff. Unfortunately, it's both a safe red seat, and I can't trust her campaign because it's run by Sima Hernandez, so nothing really I can say about that. In Texas District 30, Jasmine Crockett managed to win, and I mean, I didn't support her in the initial election, but she's basically the quote-unquote runoff progressive, so I mean, I guess I support her in this time. Maybe we'll see if she actually lives up to those ideals, or if she's a fraud, but either way, as of right now, it seems like a W. And in Texas District 28, it's a very, very, very close race. Technically, Vallejo's is closer, but this is more high profile. And even though it's been a while, it still hasn't been called. And there's not much else we can do but wait. Speaking of waiting, you don't have to wait anymore for the main topic of this video. I told you this was going to be a recurring series, and now we've reached the point where we can talk about my problem with the Working Families Party. But first, a brief summary of who they are. The Working Families Party is a political party founded in 1998 out of the ashes of another political party known as the New Party. As the name suggests, the latter was supposed to be a new political force, and the former is supposed to be a party that represents the interests of working families. The backbone of both groups being made up of union members and community organizers, which naturally led them to be sort of on the left of center progressive side of things, not explicitly socialist, maybe slightly social democratic, but essentially they're left of center and they're not exactly too fond of capitalism. Now, as the name suggests, this isn't necessarily a political organization like DSA or Justice Democrats. It's actually a point-blank, explicit political party. Now, one interesting thing that separates them from other third parties is the electoral strategy that they use. You see, during the entire tenure of the New Party, they basically spent that entire time trying to reintroduce the idea of electoral fusion to the national stage. For those who don't know what that is, electoral fusion is when one party endorses another party's candidate and in a lot of cases gets listed as the candidate of that party. An example from down south would be Mexico, where they would list all of the parties and then list the nominee of said party, which if you were a fusion candidate, you'd be listed under the ballot line of multiple parties. So if you're a guy who's like, I love AMLO so much, but I'm not necessarily interested in Morena, so I'll vote for him on the PT line. Now, in most Latin American countries, they get to have fun with their ballots, and they actually get to have, pictures of the candidates that you can cross out, but in America, we know that's not how it works, and it's just words. It's actually a thing that's been incredibly prevalent in US politics for a while. In 1872, the Democrats essentially decided to become a fusion ballot line, and instead endorse the candidate of the Liberal Republican Party. But the most prevalent example that you might know of, but the most prominent example that you might be aware of, comes from the People's Party, not that one, the older one, fusing with the Democratic Party's nominee, William Jennings Bryan, in 1896 and 1900, because Bryan happened to support their pet issue. And this trend basically continued and has actually been quite beneficial for people in the long run. Bimetallism became a mainstream political issue thanks to the People's Party fusing with William Jennings Bryan, thus making it basically common sense. The progressive parties of California and Wisconsin were actually able to grow into pretty viable political forces thanks to their relationship with the state GOPs, and even one of my favorite congressmen, Vito Marcantonio, essentially used fusionism to his advantage, basically campaigning for the American Labor Party candidacy and the Republican ballot line as well, and essentially just incentivized people to vote for him on the American Labor Party line, and basically came in as an American laborite. And since it has become very prevalent, the duopoly has basically done everything in their power to push fusionism to the side, and now it's only an option in 8 states, and in California, it's only an option for presidential elections. However, one of the states where fusionism is still a very viable force is New York, which is where the Working Families Party has decided to set up shop and rose quickly in prominence, basically becoming a B-list political party in New York, right under the duopoly with the Conservative Party of New York. If you somehow still haven't picked it up, the Working Families Party uses the fusionism strategy, and essentially endorses candidates from the two parties that they prefer, most likely it's going to be the Democrats, and give them their own ballot line, rarely ever running their own candidates, and usually if they do, it's for a very small state office, like a city council member or like a state representative if you're lucky. And I might be wondering, how can that translate into a viable third party? Well, you see, what sets the WFP apart from certain other ballot lines in New York, most particularly I'm referring to the Conservative Party and the Independence Party, is they don't just do it to win. Like the Conservative Party essentially just endorses whoever the Republican nominee will be, and the Independence Party literally endorses whoever is going to win the seat, regardless if they're a Republican or a Democrat. But the Working Families Party tries to do things a little different. You see, they basically played the long game. You see, originally, they did basically just endorse the Democrats 100% without batting an eye. But then, after they would endorse the Democrats, they would greatly encourage people to vote for the Democrats on the Working Families Party line. And then, with that, they would get more state funds, and then they would do it again, and then they would do it again, until the modern day, they've essentially grown to be such a very big part of New York politics that they can essentially negotiate with the New York Democratic Party. And usually they'll try to back a progressive challenger to the seat, like if it's an open seat or like a very, very rare chances like a primary. They'll basically push for the most progressive option in the seat, and then afterwards they'll endorse the Democratic nominee, whoever it is. But that doesn't mean they don't push really hard for that progressive to get the nomination. And usually they'll try to use that in a sort of like, oh, we'll only back you if you promise to back this specific policy, and they'll go, oh, okay. And since they're not laid back in regards to how they nominate people, they have actually had some issues with the New York Democratic Party. Yes, they can negotiate, but they also still have issues, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's talk over my initial problem. If you know anything about me, you'll understand that I'm not particularly a fan of this strategy. I've made it very abundantly clear that I believe that lefties need to exert more power and independence from the Democratic Party. I want there to be a viable third force in US politics, and that'd be a force of the left. Especially if you're trying to be a political party, you should definitely try running your own people. Now, I'm not asking for them to run basically candidates in every single New York office, like, oh, we have AOC versus the Working Families Party person, or Mondaire Jones versus the Working Families Party person. You know what I mean. I'm not saying they need to run against everybody, but maybe be open to running against the most egregious Democrats in New York. For example, in the 2020 elections, the Working Families Party openly made it known who they were backing, and there were some notable names left out. Most prominently, that I remember, were Max Rose and Richie Torres, because those two were basically nowhere close to progressive. And I basically wondered, why not just run against them? I mean, even if you wanted to say, oh, Max Rose was in a swing seat, so we couldn't run against him. What about Richie? Richie was in a safe seat, if I remember correctly. Why not make an example and say, hey, we're gonna do a hardline stance against Richie Torres? And it stinks even more so because in that race, Samalis Lopez was endorsed by the Working Families Party and was on the ballot as the Working Families Party nominee. Why didn't she run? Well, you see, it's because the Working Families Party has this sort of tradition, and the tradition is if they endorse somebody who doesn't end up becoming the Democratic nominee, they will then have that person drop out of the race. But see, the thing is, you can't just drop out of the race. Apparently that's not allowed in New York. So what they do is they get that person to file to run in a very small seat, random, a city council race or something, and then give their nomination in that seat to the Democratic nominee. However, that's not always what happens. In 2018, the Working Families Party decided to endorse Joe Crowley against AOC, and then when he lost, Joe Crowley refused to do so, and then remained on the ballot anyways. Speaking of endorsements, the endorsements don't necessarily add up. While I explained how they do things, that's not always how things turn out, as sometimes they'll make a mistake. As progressive organizations do, sometimes they don't endorse the people that you think they should. And with the Working Families Party, their rules are very, very weird in regards to who they endorse and not, and how much of the rules are they willing to do. You see, as I mentioned previously, they endorsed against AOC and basically couldn't make Joe Crowley drop out, but in that same cycle, they forced Cynthia Nixon and Jumaine Williams to do it. It's weird they demand the people who are progressives, the people they claim to be in support of, to drop out, but then don't hold the establishment Democrats to that same standard. And another gubernatorial case, one that was a bit more controversial, was in 2018, they decided to snub Zephyr Teachout's bid for governor, despite the fact that she was actually running to be the Working Families Party nominee before she ended up running as a Democrat. She actually ran as a Democrat after they chose to endorse Andrew Cuomo. And that cycle was actually making big headlines because many people were saying, is this going to be the election cycle where they snub Andrew Cuomo? And as you can tell, they didn't do that. Now, the reason why was actually because they were already a thorn in Andrew Cuomo's side, and Cuomo was basically floating the idea of not even accepting the Working Families Party nomination. And in that cycle, he decided to create a new ballot line called the Women's Equality Party, a party that has a very suspiciously similar looking acronym to the Working Families Party. Literally the only difference is a line. Despite the fact that they had been loyally backing the Democratic nominee for so long, they were being snubbed, as during the tenure of Cuomo, he's essentially trying to change the threshold that you need in votes and in donations and in signatures to be right around a gray area with the Working Families Party. You know, an area where it's like they could hypothetically get that, but they also hypothetically might be just short of it. But of course, I can't necessarily talk about the Working Families Party and endorsements without getting into probably one of their most controversial endorsements ever. First, we have to set the scene. You see, as I've told you before, the Working Families Party basically had to shift a little bit into the strategy of backing left person and then backing Democratic nominee. Originally, they were just Democratic nominees' second ballot line. But in 2015, in this trend, they made a stunning decision to make their first official national endorsement as a party, rather than the passive, oh yeah, we're also the Democratic nominees' secondary ballot line. They made the stunning decision to announce support for Bernie's 2016 bid. And you can't really do that and then go back to silently just backing the Democratic nominee. So for that, plus the added boost of Working Families Party members thanks to the Bernie 2016 bid, the Working Families Party decided to do something a little bit more than just a convention. They made their 2020 endorsement thing a huge event. They announced on their Twitter that they were going to be holding this big hashtag event. Basically, they brought 6 people out: Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bill de Blasio, Elizabeth Warren, and of course, Bernie Sanders, and said, we're going to be choosing one of these 6 as our nominee. Join the Working Families Party now, and you can be part of the process to choose our nominee, not just by what they set up to this point, but they were also going to have all 6 of those people go to a Working Families Party event, give a speech in front of members of the Working Families Party, get questions asked to them, and basically overall try to pitch themselves as the Working Families Party nominee. And they even decided to implement a ranked choice voting in the thing. So basically you could be like Julian Castro, Elizabeth Warren, or Bill de Blasio, Bernie Sanders, or Cory Kamala. Usually the decision process was made through some boring email thing, but no, they were gearing up this was going to be this really big thing, and they hyped it up a lot. They were like, we're the biggest progressive third party in America, and we're hyping up we're going to be pushing for the most progressive option in this cycle, and it made a stunning choice to nominate Elizabeth Warren to be their nominee. Almost immediately, there were issues. Many people who were members of the Working Families Party, or the quote-unquote members of the Working Families Party that signed up specifically for this nomination process, said, wait, this doesn't make any sense. I voted Bernie. Basically every single person I know in the party voted for Bernie. Oh, this is so confusing. They didn't know. A lot of members of the party were very confused, and the general populace who were not members of the party were pretty confused. Why this? And then people said, okay, well, maybe if you gave us the, numbers, we'd probably see, get an understanding of what's going on. And many people were like, okay, maybe it was just a really close race, but since ranked choice voting was a thing, Warren got a slight edge. Then the Working Families Party decided to publish this. 60.91% of their voters went to Warren, and 35.82% went to Bernie. First of all, many people said there was no way that was the case. But second of all, notice a couple of people missing? Yeah, there were like 4 other candidates in the race. You see, for some reason, the Working Families Party decided to only publish the numbers from Warren and Bernie and call it a day. Then, as those numbers were being published, many people found out through this that there was apparently a caste system with their primary. Basically, here's how it goes. Party heads and party members have different votes, but the votes of party heads and party members are treated as basically 50-50. But you see, the issue was like there's obviously less leaders of the Working Families Party than members of the Working Families Party. So people were saying like, wait, does it make sense to count them as 50-50? And with this new piece of information, people were basically like, oh, okay, so generally we believe that Warren got like 80% of the vote from party heads and around 40% of the membership vote. But since the small party heads are basically treated as like the equal in numbers as the vast populace of the Working Families Party, they were both just lumped together, and how it worked essentially just gave Warren a favor. And the big issue was like they didn't publish the actual numbers. Like if it was like, oh, like I mean they just published the percentages but not the numbers, because many people think like if the numbers were shown, maybe something would be very off. And that's why they didn't publish the numbers, because like let's say you have like 5 party heads and like 10 party members, and those 5 party heads are essentially treated as literally equal to those 10 normal party members. If the actual numbers of votes for things in that party were to come out, then it would look very suspicious. Many people even point blank compared it to superdelegates, you know, the thing that many people were trying to get away from. But here's the thing. The Working Families Party actually kind of has a very interesting history about not publishing the numbers. We know that in the 2014 governor's race, the vote totals were 59% to 41% in favor of Cuomo, but we never really got numbers to back up those claims. Even more confusing was that Howie Hawkins was apparently also seeking the Working Families Party nomination in that race, but did he end up filing? Was he like put in a blank category? Like I mean, with that, what about blanks? Like, did they count abstentions? During the 2018 cycle, we know for a fact that Cynthia Nixon got 91% of the vote over Cuomo's 8%, but what about the actual numbers? In the 2016 presidential endorsement, we know the results are 87 to 12 to 1 for Bernie, Hillary, and O'Malley, and in the general election, we know that 68% of the Working Families Party members chose to back Hillary, but, say it with me, we don't have the numbers. Now, off the numbers, we're actually going to get back to some weird endorsements that they've made, and this is kind of more of like a state issue, well, I mean, except for one, but it seems that state affiliates of the Working Families Party are not necessarily better than the national party. In Colorado, the Working Families Party decided to pull the endorsement of a candidate named Neil Walia, stating, quote, "He's not committed to running a serious campaign," but the problem is, they pulled the endorsement literally the day after Neil Walia actually managed to get on the ballot. Basically, a piece of evidence that he is taking the race very seriously if he actually managed to get on the ballot. In New Jersey, their affiliate of the Working Families Party made the stunning decision to not back Imani Oakley, a woman whose career was literally leading the New Jersey affiliate of the Working Families Party. And you might say, well, I mean, what's the issue? They didn't just not back her, they backed her opponent. A very strange decision nonetheless. Another strange decision was they backed Malcolm Kenyatta. I'm never living that down. But if all this stuff made you mad, then I have some bad news for you. I saved the worst one for last. I don't even know if I can say it. But my biggest problem with the Working Families Party is that logo. Look, for one of the newfangled progressive organizations, I guess it's fine. But the classic logo is more aesthetically pleasing and actually gives more of a working class families type vibe. It just makes more sense than like the new like pretty colors and stuff. And all these criticisms and stuff come from a person who, if they lived in New York, I would literally do a turncoat thing just so I could become the only member of the Working Families Party in Congress. Literally, the plan would be I would run as a Democrat and then get the Working Families Party endorsement, and then I change my voter affiliation to be the Working Families Party, and then basically incentivize all the people to vote for me on the Working Families Party line. And then with that, I would then run in the Democratic primaries for future races. But basically, on all the paperwork and all this stuff, I would basically be listed as the Working Families Party candidate. But that's not going to happen because I don't live in New York. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when that future video comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can get on our website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles on the independent political report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.